Okay, what's happening in the world? 1850 to 1900. There's a lot to cover. We're just going to cover the history. We're going to talk a little bit about dress reform and abolitionists and changes in technology and the first couture French house. The invention of the sewing machine, became a boon for the manufacturing of ready-to-wear clothing. It's going to open doors for Levis and Strauss, and it also moved towards the development of couture, of ready-to-wear garments. In 1858, the first French couture house, the House of Worth, opened its doors. It was actually founded by an Englishman, Charles Worth, who moved to France, unable to speak any French, with only 117 francs in his pocket, and he came to Paris to work in fabric textile houses. So if we're talking about history, like, why are we talking about garments already, Professor Johnson? And we're talking about that because Worth dressed the most respectable as well as some of the most notorious women in the world. So he had Queen Victoria, but he also had Cora Pearl, which was a well-known courtesan. He also sold designs for adaptation for foreign dressmakers in stores, and he had a unique aspect in his engineering. The unique thing with his construction is that he designed his clothes so that each part would fit interchangeably with another. So, for example, the sleeve on this garment could fit any number of bodices, and the bodices could fit any number of skirts. And he worked until 1880, and then his sons took over his business, and stayed in business until the 1930s. At this point, England is at the mid-stage of the Victorian era. Queen Victoria was nearing the middle of her life, but the British enjoyed prosperity marked by increasing imports and exports. And many countries envied Britain's industrial acumen and tried to emulate its success. France, on the other hand, was still suffering through, what had happened with the French Revolution and what's known as the Second Republic. But Charles Worth did help Paris become the fashion center of Europe. So now the United States, right? In this period that coincided with the Civil War, Americans were about 23 million people, and a little more than half still lived east of the Mississippi River. 12% of our population at this time was foreign-born. And thanks to the Industrial Revolution, annual output of factories surpassed that of agricultural products. Although education remained predominantly private, the foundations for public school education had been laid. And in 1862, Congress passed the Morrill Act that established a land grant system of higher education. So these established public colleges and universities in most of the Midwest, Eastern, and Southern states. The women's rights movement had begun in the 1850s, and it was often an alliance between the anti-slavery abolitionist movement and the temperance or anti-alcohol movements. Women at this time still lived under many legal and social restrictions, so they had no control over property, they couldn't vote, and in some states, as late as 1850, a husband was allowed to beat his wife with a reasonable instrument. Before we move on to the Civil War, I want to talk about the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in California in 1848 that brought thousands of prospectors to the West. And along with them, entrepreneurs arrived with garments that they knew that these miners needed. And one of those entrepreneurs was Levi Strauss. The miners complained that their pants didn't last long under the rough work of mining and the pockets ripped. So it was actually a tailor named Jacob David who secured the pockets with rivets. And when Davis didn't want to patent the design, he sold the design to Levi, who was actually owner of the fabric supply house. The miners loved the durability of those, in quote, those pants that Levi made for us, right? And many of the trademark features that we see with Levi were actually added later. So the double arch design on the pockets in the orange thread was in 1873. The leather patch was in 1866. Belt loops in 1922. And the red tab was 1936. So now we're at the Civil War, and hopefully national divisions over slavery came to a head between the North and the South. And the Civil War had profound and far-reaching effects on American society. And not just society, but also the political system and the economy. And what the conflict did, what the Civil War did, is it halted succession, and in effect, it ended slavery, in theory. So when I say in theory, just because the war started doesn't mean that all enslaved people were automatically freed. It wasn't until the end of the war that actually established the ending of slavery. And if you know the story of Juneteenth, some folks in Texas didn't find out that slavery ended until much, much later. But what slavery did do is it consolidated our central government. What the Civil War did for fashion is it accelerated the spread of mechanization and of the factory system. So the number of sewing machines doubled between 1860 and 1865, and the production of shoes increased during the war with development of machines that could sew the upper part of the shoe to the sole. So what that did is that set the groundwork for the mass production of clothing that we see going forward to the 19th century. So I mentioned it a couple times, but let's, in the historical perspective, talk about the impact of the sewing machine. The first patents for the sewing machine were in 1840s, and the public response was not overwhelming just because it was expensive. It was about $100 in 1850 money. But in 1857, a Virginia farmhand devised a simpler, less expensive sewing machine for about $50. But it wasn't until unemployed mechanic and actor Isaac Singer developed a cost-effective sewing machine. And Singer sewing machines became one of the first domestic appliances to be manufactured on a production line basis using interchangeable parts. And this allowed him to drop the price significantly. But it really was a Civil War that demonstrated the usefulness of the sewing machine and that ability to create ready-to-wear garments. During the war, the Union Army collected statistics on the form and build of American males and developed some statistical sizes that were used by civilian manufacturers to develop ready-to-wear clothing during the Civil War, but more importantly, after the Civil War. The sewing machine became the needed product in order to produce these garments. At the close of the war and the world turning back to normal, seamstresses that generally worked in their home were hired out by clothing manufacturers to do piecework. They saw the benefit of the increased speed of the sewing machine, and those savings it was major savings in time on simple items like men's shirts and dresses, and that allowed these garments to be mass produced. Okay, so there you have it. You have the history of 1850s to 1900s in a handful of sentences, in a handful of slides. So dive on into the next part of the lecture.